Senator Bernardi.
Mr Deputy President, or Acting Deputy President, this bill was, relatively speaking, a relatively innocuous piece of housekeeping that was designed to support Australia's world-leading successful border protection policies. And it is no secret that there are those in this chamber and out there in the broader community and in the other place who don't like these successful border protection policies, who think we should be pursuing a different course. And Senator Storer belled the cat then when he identified, said the Greens are at the forefront of stopping detention for unlawful entrants. And that's what worries me. That's what worries me. The Greens are at the forefront of it. And we know how the Greens respond to the people smuggling industry. To be frank, they don't give a hoot. They do not give a hoot. They have given excuse after excuse after excuse why it's okay for people to travel through multiple countries, pay tens of thousands of dollars to people to put them in a leaky boat, to risk their lives at sea, lose their lives at sea. And the Greens think that's okay. Senator Storer, I'm sorry, I say to you, Mr Acting Deputy President, I cannot under any circumstances think that is a virtue. And even worse, when the 1,000 people or so that lost their lives at sea when under the Green Labor Alliance, we had the cavalier dismissal of these tragic deaths by the likes of Senator Hanson-Young, who purports to care, but then on the public record says, accidents happen, tragedies happen, shrug the shoulders, it's not her fault, move along here, nothing to see. Unfortunately, those deaths are inked indelibly on the legislation that was repealed by the Labor-Greens alliance. It is a tragedy and a travesty that after 5 or 6 years of successfully stopping the boats, putting an end to this insidious industry, the crack is being opened up again. And it only needs to be opened up a sliver for the people smugglers to take advantage of the vulnerable who are seeking a better life, take advantage of the vulnerable, part them from their money and put them back on the boats again. Now, I don't know anybody who doesn't have compassion for those who are unwell, who doesn't have compassion for those who strive for a better life for them and their families. But if a country is not prepared to defend its borders, if a country is not prepared to stand up for an orderly and sensible migration program, including a humanitarian one, it loses its reason for being. A country is united by its borders, if nothing else. It should be culture and values and ideas. But it is united by its borders. And if you believe it's okay for people to jump the queue, and there is a queue to come to Australia, I can assure you of that, if you think it's okay to perpetuate and foster a business that smuggles people and encourages them to break the law, I think you're barking mad. And unfortunately, there are people who are barking mad in politics and in the advocacy space. And now we see them taking a relatively innocuous housekeeping bill and trying to dress it up in some moral debate about relieving children or taking children off of Nauru and Manus in the name of some compassion. Let me tell you where that will end up. It will open up the people smuggling business again. It will say, we're open for business, and it might take you a bit of time, but we can get there. And they'll be aided and abetted by people in this place, by a phalanx of doctors who will make all sorts of claims because they're ideologically wedded to an open borders policy. And it's starting here. It's starting here. I'm appalled. But it gives the Australian people an opportunity to understand what life would be like under a Shorten/Greens-dominated government. You understand that for all the posturing and all the claims that nothing will change under us, it'll be a fairer and more just system, you know, underpinning that is always the agenda to just leave the door ajar, just a little bit unguarded, to open it up. And here we're seeing that today. We're seeing it today. And I call upon Labor, Mr Acting Deputy President, to reject the hijacking of a housekeeping bill in the name of some humanitarian efforts that are putting children as pawns. Children as pawns in a political game which is unedifying. Let's face the facts. Not everyone wants to live on a tropical island paradise. I understand that. Not everyone does. But you know, if you're going to be living on Nauru, and I'm not going to demean Nauru or diminish the land or the people as others in this place will do, but if you're going to be on Nauru and the Australian government is educating your children, providing you with accommodation, a safe place to be, freedom to get out and about wherever you like to, feeding you, providing you with free medical care and attention, that's better than many communities have it in Australia. And yet I don't hear the posturing, I don't hear the condemnation of what's happening in some of our Indigenous communities where kids are being abused every single day, and they're excused by the same people who are claiming to stick up for those who are on Nauru because they've paid the people smugglers. They want to open the people smuggler system. They want to help a bunch of people over there who are being cared for better than the first Australians in many instances. It's an appalling act of hypocrisy. Shouldn't we, at our primary aim, is yes, we've got to have compassion for what happens in the rest of the world, but shouldn't the primary aim, if you're going to help the most disadvantaged, look within our own community first and foremost? And if you go to an Indigenous community, you will see higher rates of suicide, mental health issues, substance abuse issues, the lack of job, educational opportunities, lack of health care. You will see abhorrent sexual diseases like syphilis. The only occurrence of them, according to statistics I have, in children under 10 in this country are in Indigenous communities. And yet the silence is deafening from those who want to stick up for people that are on Nauru through their own actions and that are being cared for better than our first Australians. Spare me the hypocrisy here. It is galling, it is breathtaking. And I don't think the Australian people are being well served on the very last day of this parliament or this year's parliamentary sittings to have to go through such an unedifying spectacle where children are being used as pawns in a political game designed to discredit the government. Now, to be frank, the government doesn't need any more assistance in discrediting itself. I see Senator Cormann not liking that comment, but you know, the reality is they've done enormous damage to the revolving door of Prime Ministers, their policy areas where they're putting taxes up one day, cutting them the next and so forth. They're inconsistent. Some of the people there are of questionable judgment and character, but it is what it is. The one thing they've got right, and they've been consistent on and advocates for, is defending Australia's borders and the offshore processing regime, which is more humane and more just, which provides and protects and saves lives, unlike the policies of those on the other side. And simply through the sheer opportunism of those who want a virtue signal rather than look at the reality of what we're dealing with, those many thousands of lives could be put at risk because this Senate or the House of Representatives may leave the national security, the border protection laws ajar, and outsource Australia's domestic sovereignty, if I can say that, the principles of the Westminster system, the role of executive government and the minister, outsource that to the unelected doctors. You know, there's any number of doctors that have political views and ideology, and sometimes they trump the Hippocratic Oath. Sometimes they do. Do no harm. First, do no harm is a Hippocratic oath, and yet you have doctors out there, like Dr. Philip Nitschke, who until he was disqualified, was actually openly putting people to death. Is he going to be the person that's going to go up there to Nauru and determine someone's mental health? He couldn't even determine whether someone was terminally ill or just depressed when he helped kill that poor lady in Darwin all those years ago. Australia's border protection policies are the envy of the world. And for those who laughed at them all those years ago, they're wishing they enabled them now. You go to Europe, and the open border policies of Angela Merkel, the Chancellor there, has done irreparable damage to the German psyche and their way of life. We know that. We also know that in places like Italy and in France and in Greece and in Turkey, the people smuggling business has had tragic results. And governments all over the world are saying, hey, Australia managed to get it right. And just as they're coming to their senses, you're finding a motley bunch trying to undo the good that has been done. Our immigration policies in this country have to work in our cultural, our social and our economic interest. The Australian Conservatives are a party that has a comprehensive policy that was designed to do exactly that. We believe that those who come here, choose to come here, must contribute to Australia, that if they're in receipt of welfare, they should be expected to repay that over the course of time through the taxation system. We believe that it's no longer appropriate to be bound by a UN Refugee Convention that was established in the 1950s for a different time and is now being used against us. We believe that we shouldn't resettle those who arrive in this country illegally. And there's no doubt further reforms are needed. We need to reform the visa class. We need to reform the processes that are used to obtain visas, the misuse and abuse of them, the corruption of them, quite frankly, both in this country and abroad, where people are gaming the system. Just like some people in politics today want to help refugees or alleged refugees to game the system. Now, I don't want to stand for the dismantling of our successful border protection policies. I want to enhance and improve them. I want to improve Australia's national security through reform of our immigration system. And that's the platform that the Australian Conservatives will be advocating for a very long time. But in respect to this particular legislation, I know there are movements coming, there are amendments coming, I beg your pardon, and we've got some ourselves. I move the amendments as circulated on sheet 8621, which add to the end of the motion, and they're quite four simple premises. One is that the government should promptly release the statutory review of the Administrative Appeals Tribunal, particularly those aspects relating to the Migration and Refugee Divisions conducted by the Honourable Ian Callanan ACQC. Now, we know in respect to that Mr Callanan, or former Justice Callanan, was expected to have that report completed, I think, at the end of October. I would have presumed it would have gone to the government by now, but of course yesterday the Minister representing the Attorney-General said it hadn't been received. It seems to have been received by the Daily Telegraph, but not by the government and the Minister. So I'm not sure how that quite works, but some things, the processes in government, confound even me, who's been around here for a little while. But it's absolutely appropriate that that should be released promptly, and I think the government needs to be held to account for that. We also are moving that the government should take all possible steps to prevent the presentation of late evidence in migration and refugee cases in respect to the Administrative Appeals Tribunal. Because what happens is the government, of course, or the Minister of the day will say, you're a pedophile, you're a convicted pedophile or a terrorist or a substantive crook or an Iranian tourist. And I was asked what an Iranian tourist is. They're the people that come here, seek to be to asylum because they're threatened with death in Iran, and then as soon as they're granted asylum, they go back to Iran for a holiday and then come back here again. That's called the Iranian tourist rort. Well, we've got to put an end to that, let me tell you. And so you shouldn't be able to have a deportation order, go to the AAT, and then all of a sudden these taxpayer-funded lawyers and advocates all jump in with late evidence to try and put an end to it. We've got to stop the rorts, and it's within the government's purview to do that, and they should do it. Which brings me to the next amendment, Mr Acting Deputy President. Only Australian citizens should be given access to legal aid assistance in cases in the Migration and Review Division of the Administrative Appeals Tribunal. Why is it that Australia's taxpayers are being put on the hook and asked to pay for the defence of the indefensible? The pedophiles, the terrorists, the habitual criminals, the Iranian tourists who are sucking at the taxpayers' teeth in order to fund the defence of their own crimes. It's an appalling indictment upon our system here. There are Australians in this place, in Australia, there are many Australians who can't afford legal aid, they don't qualify for legal aid, they can't afford legal representation, and yet somehow this injustice is being provided to those who aren't even our citizens. Indeed, if legal aid is granted in the Migration and Review Division of the Administrative Appeals Tribunal to persons who are not Australian citizens, then the quantum of the grant of legal aid should be recovered via the taxation system in future years. So that means if legal aid is provided to a non-Australian citizen and they're successful and they get to remain in the country despite their terrorism offences or paedophilia offences or habitual criminals or sexual harassment or being Iranian tourists and lying, if they happen to get through that, which is not unusual in a stacked tribunal like the AAT, then they should be expected to repay that benefit through the taxation system, through an additional impost or, indeed, through the welfare system. Because let's remind ourselves, many of these people who come here are still on welfare 10 years later. In fact, in some classes of refugee, up to 95% of people are still obtaining welfare benefits 10 years after the event. So, it's been indicated to me, Madam Acting Deputy President, that there are a number of people in this chamber who have different views on some of these things, and so I would ask that when you put these, that they be dealt with individually, because I think some of them are absolutely critical to the future success of this. And I'd also be moving an amendment on sheet 8.6, I beg your pardon, and at the end of these amendments, I will also ask that there be a section E be applied. And section E is quite simply that consideration of the bill be deferred until after the next federal election. The battle lines need to be drawn. The battle lines need to be drawn for the Australian people. No matter how hopeless they may think this government is, no matter how uninspired they may be by the opposite side and the alternative government, there is one clear line of demarcation, and that is the coalition are absolutely, positively right on defending Australia's borders. We need an orderly migration program. We need a migration program that is humane, that is caring, it is compassionate, but it is going to work in Australia's economic, our social and our cultural interests. What is being proposed today, what has been cobbled together in such an imprudent fury, will damage that position. And if you want to know how imprudent it is, this bill was brought in as a guillotine, so we're not going to be able to debate all the things substantially. We're not going to be able to deal with it. And Senator Wong, in trying to close down even a second reading debate, was hoist on her own petard. Her plotting and Machiavellian scheming worked against her. And if she can't even trust herself to get her own plotting and scheming right, how can the Australian people trust her as the Foreign Minister, or Mr Shorten as the Prime Minister of this country? If you care for Australia, if you care for our refugees, if if you care for our migration policies, if you care for our humanitarian intake, you will vote against this bill as it's proposed to be amended. And I say that, Madam Acting Deputy President, and I thank the Senate for their time.
Thank you, Senator Bernardi. Senator Bernardi, just a moment, Senator Abetz. Senator Bernardi, are you seeking to amend your amendment?
I did. I moved my amendment on sheet 8621, and yes, I beg your pardon. I must seek leave to move the following amendment to that amendment, and adding what section E, as I said during my speech.
Is leave granted? Leave is not granted, Senator Bernardi.